Picture this. You are drowning in a river of mud and blood, and you cannot feel your legs. The air around you reeks of burning pitch, roasted flesh, and panic. You are a sailor of the great Yuan dynasty, the most terrifying military machine the world has ever known, but right now, your invincible armada is being chewed to pieces. The wooden deck of your warship is splintering under you, pierced from below by massive iron-tipped stakes hidden beneath the murky water. You claw at the shattered timber, gasping for air as your heavy armor drags you down into the abyss. Around you, thousands of your brothers are being skewered, crushed, and incinerated. You look to the riverbanks, expecting to see a massive army of giants, but there are only shadows in the jungle, firing flaming arrows with terrifying precision. You are dying, not on the glorious steps of your ancestors, but in a humid, diseased swamp at the edge of the world. This is the Bach Dang River in 1288, the graveyard of the Mongol Empire, and the site of the most humiliating, meticulously engineered slaughter in naval history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how the apex predators of the 13th century ended up as fish food in a Southeast Asian delta, you have to understand the mind of Kublai Khan. By the late 1200s, the Mongol Empire was not just a country, it was a planetary phenomenon. They had swallowed China, crushed the Middle East, and terrorized Eastern Europe. They did not just win wars, they erased entire civilizations from the map. When Kublai Khan looked at the globe, he did not see sovereign nations, he saw future provinces. And down in the humid tropical south lay a small but stubbornly independent kingdom known as Dai Viet. Kublai Khan wanted total submission. He wanted a launchpad to conquer the rest of Southeast Asia. He wanted the trade routes, the spices, and the absolute obedience of every breathing soul on the continent. But the Vietnamese had a very different plan. They had already embarrassed the Mongols before, utilizing a frustrating, highly mobile form of guerrilla warfare that stripped the Mongol cavalry of their open field advantage. The great Khan was furious. The idea that a tiny jungle kingdom could defy the masters of the world was a psychological splinter he could not ignore. He needed to make an example of them. He needed to burn Dai Viet to ash. So Kublai Khan assembled a nightmare. He unleashed a massive invasion force, spearheaded by a colossal naval fleet of hundreds of warships under the command of a ruthless general named Omar. The Mongols were adapting. They knew the land routes through the mountains were choked with ambushes and logistical dead ends, so they brought the war to the water. The plan was brutally simple. Sail down the coast, carve through the rivers, transport endless tons of grain to feed the advancing ground troops, and crush the Vietnamese capital under the weight of sheer, overwhelming numbers. Omar commanded a floating city of death, heavily armed, packed with hardened veterans who had butchered their way across half the known world. This was not a standard military campaign, it was an extermination protocol. The Mongols expected a swift, terrifying victory. They expected the Vietnamese to look at the armada darkening their coast and drop to their knees in absolute despair. They believed their ships were floating fortresses, unsinkable and unstoppable, but arrogance is a blinding disease. The Mongols were so obsessed with the size of their swords and the numbers of their ships that they failed to respect the environment they were invading. They did not realize that the rivers of Dai Viet were not highways for their conquest. They were the arteries of a living, breathing trap designed by a military genius who was about to turn the water itself into a weapon of mass destruction. Imagine trading the endless, crisp winds of the Mongolian steppes for a suffocating blanket of wet heat. For the Mongol warrior, the world was an open ocean of grass, where a man and his horse were gods of speed and slaughter. But in Dai Viet, the horizon shrinks to a few dozen feet of impenetrable, rotting vegetation. The air does not just feel hot, it feels heavy, carrying the stench of decomposing leaves, stagnant water, and human waste. This is not a battlefield. It is a biological meat grinder. The invasion force commanded by Omar and the land generals quickly discovered that their greatest weapon, the terror of the Mongol cavalry charge, was mathematically useless here. You cannot execute a flanking maneuver in a swamp where the mud sucks the boots right off your feet. You cannot unleash a volley of arrows when the jungle canopy is so thick it blocks out the sun. The Mongols were the undisputed masters of horizontal warfare. The Vietnamese, however, were about to give them a masterclass in three-dimensional attrition, utilizing a relentless brand of Vietnam guerrilla warfare that would become the gold standard for breaking empires for centuries to come. The first enemy the Mongols met was not a wall of spears, but a cloud of mosquitoes. Malaria and dysentery swept through the camps like invisible scythes. Warriors who had survived the brutal sieges of Baghdad and the freezing campaigns in Russia were suddenly violently emptying their bowels into the mud, burning with fever and dying in agony without ever seeing a single enemy soldier. The mighty Yuan army was bleeding out from microscopic wounds, and when they did march, they marched into a void. The Mongol logistics network relied on one fundamental principle, which was feeding your army by taking the food of the people you conquer. It is a parasitic system of war that works perfectly as long as there are people and farms to pillage. But the Vietnamese leadership understood this parasite, so they starved it. They employed a ruthless, scorched earth policy. Whenever the Mongol columns arrived at a village, they found nothing but smoldering ash. The rice fields were burned, the livestock slaughtered and thrown into the wells to poison the water supply, and the population simply vanished into the green abyss. The psychological toll was devastating. The Mongols were apex predators, but how do you hunt ghosts? They would march for days, exhausted, diseased and starving, only to be hit by sudden, vicious ambushes in the dead of night. A rain of poisoned darts would fly from the darkness, a dozen men would fall clutching their throats, and by the time the Mongols drew their swords, the jungle was silent again. The Vietnamese refused to give them the one thing they craved, which was a pitched, decisive battle. They bled the invaders slowly, 1,000 tiny cuts designed to drain their morale and empty their stomachs. General Omar, commanding the massive naval fleet that was supposed to be the indestructible supply line for the entire invasion, found himself sailing into a logistical nightmare. His heavily armed warships were creeping up the twisting, treacherous river systems of the Red River Delta. The tides were violent and unpredictable, exposing jagged rocks and shifting mudbanks that grounded his vessels. His ships were packed with thousands of tons of stolen grain, intended to feed the starving land army, but the two forces could not properly coordinate. The jungle severed their communication lines. Omar was sitting on a floating mountain of resources, surrounded by a hostile green hell, while the ground troops withered away just miles out of reach. The invincible Mongol war machine was not being outfought in a glorious clash of steel. It was being outsmarted, suffocated, and slowly digested by the geography itself. They had confidently marched into a geographical trap that spanned the entire country, completely unaware that the real nightmare had not even begun. When the vanguard of the Mongol army finally breached the outer gates of Thang Long, they had their weapons drawn and their blood up. These men had dragged themselves through the green hell of the jungle, their bodies ravaged by malaria and their stomachs empty, clinging to a single, violent promise: the capital city. In the Mongol playbook of war, the capital was the ultimate prize, a place to unleash all their pent-up rage and exhaustion. They expected to hear the screams of a terrified populace. They expected to smash open the granaries and gorge themselves on mountains of rice. They expected a glorious, brutal sack. They kicked open the heavy wooden doors of the citadel, roaring for blood. What answered them was the eerie, echoing silence of the wind. Thang Long was a phantom city. The streets were entirely abandoned, the houses were stripped bare. The massive imperial storehouses, which should have been overflowing with the harvest, had been swept immaculately clean. There was not a single sack of grain, not a drop of clean drinking water, not even a stray dog left behind for slaughter. The Vietnamese emperor and the entire civilian population had simply packed up and vanished into the wilderness, taking everything of value and leaving behind a hollow, mocking shell of a metropolis. For the Mongol invaders, this was a psychological gut punch. You can swing a bloody sword at a wall of infantry, but you cannot stab starvation. The invaders wandered the empty streets of the greatest city in Dai Viet, their armor suddenly feeling like a crushing weight. They had technically captured the enemy capital, a feat that usually signaled the end of a war, but here it felt like stepping into a tomb. The Vietnamese had not just evacuated their home, they had weaponized the very concept of nothingness. This catastrophic reality exposed the fatal flaw in Kublai Khan's invasion plan. In a typical medieval naval warfare context, an amphibious assault relies entirely on the synchronization of land and sea forces. The massive fleet commanded by General Omar was specifically designed to act as a floating umbilical cord for the ground troops, carrying the thousands of tons of supplies necessary to keep a horde of this size alive. Omar's warships were supposed to be anchoring near the capital, offloading endless grain to feed the conquerors. But the riverbanks were completely empty. The fleet was nowhere to be found, hopelessly bogged down and continually harassed by rapid hit-and-run attacks in the sprawling labyrinth of the coastal delta. Without the fleet, the Mongols were stranded on an island of their own making. The men who had conquered half the known world were now huddled in the empty courtyards of a foreign palace, boiling their leather armor to chew on the straps. They began butchering their surviving horses, a desperate and sacrilegious act for a nomadic warrior culture that revered their mounts above all else. But meat spoils fast in the suffocating tropical humidity, and soon the air in the capital grew thick with the stench of rotting carcasses and human excrement. Disease ripped through the tightly packed, starving ranks with renewed ferocity. The psychological terror of the phantom capital began to break their minds. At night, the darkness surrounding the city seemed to come alive. Distant drums echoed from the impenetrable tree lines, a constant, mocking reminder that the Vietnamese army was out there, fully fed, watching them starve. Occasional volleys of fire arrows would rain down on the exhausted Mongols, just enough to ensure no one ever got a full night of sleep. The apex predators of the steppes were locked inside a gilded cage, slowly starving to death on an empty throne, waiting for a fleet that was never going to come. The mighty Yuan dynasty was not being defeated by a superior army in an open field. They were being digested by the silence. Imagine the exact moment a living god realizes he can bleed. For the elite commanders of the Yuan dynasty, sitting in the hollowed-out silent shell of Thang Long, that realization tasted like boiled leather and stagnant swamp water. The invasion had completely stalled. It had not crashed against a mighty wall of enemy shields, but rather sank into the sheer, suffocating weight of Vietnamese geography. The greatest military machine in human history was cannibalizing its own momentum. Men who had violently dismantled empires and burned global capitals were now shivering in their rusted armor, their gums bleeding from scurvy, their bowels liquid from dysentery. They had captured the prize, but the prize was a tomb. Finally, the humiliating, unthinkable reality set in. You cannot conquer a kingdom if your entire army starves to death before they can even swing a sword. The agonizing order was quietly passed down the ranks: retreat. It is hard to overstate the psychological devastation of that single word. These were not soldiers accustomed to walking backward. They were the storm, they were the apocalypse on horseback. But as they hastily packed their depleted camps, constantly checking over their shoulders at the impenetrable green tree line, a completely alien emotion infected the Mongol ranks. Prey-drive panic, the terrifying realization that they were no longer the hunters in this jungle. This humid, festering delta was the exact geographical coordinate where the terrifying myth of their invincibility finally shattered, marking the brutal, bloody genesis of the Mongol Empire decline in the east. The global war machine had finally reached the absolute limit of its digestive tract. It had bitten off a piece of the world it simply could not swallow. General Omar, the ruthless naval commander who was supposed to be the architect of Dai Viet's destruction, now found himself tasked with an entirely different, humiliating mission. He had to organize a massive, desperate evacuation. His invincible fleet, consisting of hundreds of heavy war junks originally built to supply a permanent occupation, was now being repurposed as a floating hospital and a hearse. The Mongol leadership made a desperate, splintered decision to save whatever pieces of their army were left. The land forces, under the command of Prince Togun, would attempt to hack their way back north through the treacherous, malaria-infested mountain passes. Meanwhile, Omar would take his colossal armada, heavily laden with tens of thousands of sick, starving, and desperate troops, and navigate back down the river systems to the open ocean. For Omar, the water represented a desperate salvation. The jungle was a nightmare of poisoned darts, pit traps, and invisible enemies, but the sea was neutral. The sea was a highway back to the safety of captured Chinese ports. He looked at his sprawling fleet anchored in the muddy, stinking estuaries and felt a dangerous surge of relief. His ships were still massive, their wooden hulls thick, their decks bristling with whatever arrows and gunpowder bombs they had managed to hoard. He calculated that if he could just push his heavy armada down the winding Bach Dang River and reach the vast expanse of the Gulf of Tonkin, the nightmare would end. The Vietnamese might be masters of the suffocating jungle, he reasoned, but they could not possibly stop a fully armed imperial fleet on open water. So Omar gave the signal. The heavy wooden anchors were hauled up from the sucking mud. Thousands of massive oars dipped into the murky brown water, pulled by exhausted, emaciated men rowing for their very lives. The massive armada began its slow, lumbering procession down the twisting arteries of the delta. But Omar was tragically mistaken. He was not executing a tactical withdrawal. He was being herded. Every agonizing mile the Mongol fleet sailed down that river, they were being watched. The relentless Vietnamese guerrilla attacks that had harassed them for months suddenly seemed to evaporate, tricking the terrified Mongols into a fatal false sense of security. The silence of the riverbanks was not a sign of surrender. It was the silence of a hunter holding his breath. The Mongols believed they were running away, but in reality, they were walking blindly down a meticulously constructed chute, straight into the mechanical jaws of the most terrifying slaughterhouse the medieval world had ever seen. The predator was bleeding, blind, and desperate, and the true architect of its doom was waiting patiently at the mouth of the Bach Dang. History loves to build statues of men holding swords, gazing nobly into the distance. It sanitizes them. When you read the official chronicles of Dai Viet, the supreme commander, Tran Hung Dao, is often portrayed as a flawless, almost divine figure, a savior wrapped in the glowing armor of righteousness. But if you want to understand how he actually annihilated the greatest military machine on earth, you need to strip away the marble and the mythology. Tran Hung Dao was not a saint. He was a mathematician of violence. He was a cold, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless architect of death who understood that fair fights are strictly for idiots who want to die. Facing the Mongol Empire, Tran Hung Dao knew that engaging them in a conventional open-field battle was mass suicide. The Mongols were a physical force of nature, like a hurricane made of horses, arrows, and pure aggression. You do not punch a hurricane. You let it spin itself out, and then you drown it. This was the core philosophy behind Tran Hung Dao tactics. He did not fight the Mongols where they were strong. He lured them into places where their massive size and heavy armor became fatal liabilities. He recognized that the Mongol war machine ran on three things, which were momentum, intimidation, and a constant influx of stolen calories. By employing scorched earth strategies, he had already starved their engine. But to truly break the beast, he had to slaughter its fleet. Tran Hung Dao spent months observing the enemy, diagnosing their psychological state like a surgeon examining a rotting tumor. He looked at General Omar, the commander of the Mongol fleet, and saw a man completely consumed by desperation. Omar was sitting on an armada of heavy war junks. His men were diseased and starving, and the terrifying spectre of returning to the wrathful Kublai Khan as a failure was driving him insane. Tran Hung Dao knew exactly what a desperate, arrogant predator does when cornered. It bolts for the exit. And the most logical, fastest exit to the open sea and the safety of Chinese ports was the twisting, treacherous mouth of the Bach Dang River. Omar thought the Bach Dang was a highway to salvation. Tran Hung Dao knew it was an execution chamber. The Supreme Commander did not look at the river as just a body of water. He looked at it as a living, breathing weapon, a violently shifting environment defined by extreme tidal fluctuations. The Bach Dang estuary is a deceptive stretch of water where the ocean violently pushes back against the river, causing the water level to rise and fall dramatically by several yards every single day. When the tide is high, the river looks wide, deep, and inviting, perfectly capable of accommodating massive imperial warships. But when the tide drops, the water aggressively recedes, revealing a jagged, muddy graveyard of hidden shoals and deadly currents. To the Mongols, the tide was just a minor navigational nuisance. To Tran Hung Dao, it was the mechanical jaws of a trap. He realized that if he could control the exact moment the Mongol fleet entered the river, he could literally use the gravitational pull of the moon to destroy them. He did not need to build a bigger fleet to match Omar's colossal armada. He just needed to build a killing floor beneath them. He envisioned an underwater forest, an invisible mechanical barrier of destruction that would rip the bellies out of the Mongol ships the moment the water receded. It was an apocalyptic gamble. He was betting the survival of an entire civilization, the lives of his soldiers, and the existence of his bloodline on his ability to predict the exact rhythm of the tide and the predictable arrogance of a starving empire. He was about to stop fighting the Mongols with men and start fighting them with the planet itself. The order was given, and the greatest, most agonizing engineering project in medieval warfare began in the freezing mud. To understand the scale of the trap that Tran Hung Dao was building, you have to forget everything you know about clean, modern engineering. There were no cranes, there were no power tools, there was only mud, muscle, and absolute, agonizing misery. History books will usually summarize the preparation for the Battle of Bach Dang in a single, neat sentence, stating simply that the Vietnamese planted wooden stakes in the river. That sentence is a sanitary lie that hides a mountain of human suffering. The creation of this underwater minefield was a lung-crushing, bone-breaking nightmare that demanded the blood of the very people building it before it ever touched a single enemy soldier. The primary material required for this apocalyptic wooden stake trap was a specific type of regional timber known as ironwood. If you have never handled ironwood, you need to understand that it does not behave like normal timber. It is absurdly dense, so heavy that it immediately sinks like a stone in water, and it is notoriously stubborn to cut. Chopping down a mature ironwood tree with 13th century hand axes is basically like trying to chop down a stone pillar. Thousands of conscripted peasants and soldiers were sent deep into the suffocating, mosquito-infested jungles. They hacked at these massive trunks until their hands were blistered and bleeding, their muscles tore, and their vision blurred from sheer exhaustion. But felling the trees was only the beginning of the horror. These massive logs had to be dragged out of the sweltering, unforgiving jungle by sheer human pulling power. Every inch was a desperate battle against the sucking mud, the oppressive heat, and the venomous wildlife. Once they reached the secret staging areas hidden along the riverbanks, the logs had to be sharpened into deadly, sloping points, and to ensure they could physically tear through the thick, reinforced hulls of the heavy Mongol war junks, the tips were capped with forged iron. Blacksmiths worked day and night, hammering red-hot metal in the sweltering tropical humidity, turning the edges of the river into a literal sweatshop of war. Then came the installation, which was a logistical and physical hell. The stakes could not just be dropped into the water, they had to be manually driven deep into the riverbed at a very specific, aggressive angle, pointing directly toward the approaching Mongol fleet. They had to be anchored so firmly that the kinetic impact of a multi-ton warship riding a rushing tide would not simply knock them over, and this all had to be done in complete secrecy, primarily during the agonizingly brief, dangerous windows of low tide. Imagine standing chest-deep in the freezing, murky water of the Bach Dang estuary in the dead of night. The water is entirely opaque, choked with silt. You cannot see your own feet. What you can feel are the leeches. They attach to your legs, your stomach, your arms, quietly drinking your blood while you struggle to keep your balance against the vicious, pulling undercurrents. You and a dozen other shivering, exhausted men are trying to manually hammer a massive iron-tipped tree trunk into the sucking mud beneath the surface. Your lungs burn, your grip slips on the wet bark, and the freezing water numbs your extremities to the bone. Men drowned in the dark. Limbs were brutally crushed under slipping logs. Infections from the filthy water claimed the lives of those who survived the immediate physical labor. This trap was not merely a clever tactical gimmick, it was a colossal, meticulously calculated machine built upon the agonizing sacrifice of the Vietnamese people. Tran Hung Dao's engineers had to calculate the exact height of every single stake. If they were too tall, the Mongol vanguard would spot them at high tide and abort their retreat. If they were too short, the massive ships would scrape over them safely. It required a level of mathematical precision that is almost incomprehensible given the brutal, primitive conditions of its construction. While General Omar and his starving fleet were blindly drifting down the river systems, desperate for the open ocean, the people of Dai Viet were literally bleeding into the mud of the Bach Dang, planting an invisible ironwood forest that was preparing to drink the Mongol Empire dry. Dawn breaks over the Gulf of Tonkin on April 9th, 1288. General Omar stands on the deck of his massive command junk, staring at the vast expanse of open water just beyond the river mouth. Salvation is right there. The tide is at its absolute peak, swelling the Bach Dang estuary into a wide, deep highway. Beneath the muddy, churning surface, millions of gallons of ocean water have rushed in, completely submerging Tran Hung Dao's ironwood forest. To the naked eye, the river looks perfectly safe. To a desperate, starving Mongol army, it looks like a miracle. But miracles in warfare are usually just traps waiting to be sprung. Tran Hung Dao knows that simply planting stakes is not enough. You cannot just build a trap. You have to force the beast to step into it at the exact right moment. If Omar sails through too slowly or cautiously tests the waters, the tide might drop prematurely, revealing the jagged wooden teeth and allowing the Mongols to abort their retreat. Tran Hung Dao needs Omar to sprint. He needs the Mongol fleet to commit all of its massive forward momentum, completely blinding them to the changing physics of the river. He needs a matador's cape. So, from the misty banks of the river, a tiny, almost laughable Vietnamese flotilla emerges. These are not heavy warships. They are light, incredibly fast skirmish vessels, completely dwarfed by the towering wooden fortresses of the Yuan armada. They row directly into the path of the Mongol vanguard, firing a pathetic scattered volley of arrows against the thick wooden hulls of the imperial ships, before immediately turning around and fleeing in apparent terror. It is a classic feigned retreat, the oldest trick in the military playbook, and ironically, a tactic the Mongols themselves had used to conquer the known world. But human psychology is a dangerous vulnerability, especially when mixed with sheer desperation. General Omar is not thinking clearly. His men are diseased, his pride is shattered, and he has spent months being humiliated by an invisible enemy hiding in the trees. Now finally, the enemy is right in front of him, out in the open, and they look incredibly weak. The predatory instinct of the Mongol war machine violently overrides any remaining tactical caution. Omar does not see a mathematically calculated trap. He sees an opportunity to butcher his tormentors before he escapes. He screams the order to advance. Massive war drums echo across the muddy water, and thousands of exhausted, starving oarsmen put their backs into the stroke. The colossal, heavy-bottomed Mongol junks surge forward, their prows cutting through the current, chasing the nimble Vietnamese boats deeper into the estuary. The Vietnamese crews are rowing for their absolute lives, skimming perfectly over the surface of the water, intentionally leading the massive Mongol fleet directly over the submerged killing field. The tension in this historical moment is physically suffocating. Deep beneath the creaking wooden hulls of Omar's advancing fleet, thousands of iron-tipped spikes are waiting in the dark. The deep-draft Mongol ships are gliding barely inches above the deadly points, entirely protected by the temporary artificial depth of the high tide. The invaders are cheering, firing their crossbows, leaning over the rails, believing they are finally running down their cowardly prey. They are pushing deeper and deeper into the bottleneck, fully committing hundreds of tons of wood and flesh to the pursuit. Then the Vietnamese bait boats do something that immediately kills the cheers of the advancing fleet. They stop. The fleeing sailors drop their oars in perfect synchronization, and they turn their prows back toward the massive approaching armada. The chase is abruptly over. The matador has planted his feet in the dirt. The beast is exactly where it is supposed to be, floating right over the center of the wooden teeth. And in the sky above them, the moon continues its silent, relentless orbit, and the gravitational pull begins to shift. The tide does not simply recede in the Bach Dang estuary, it collapses. Driven by the relentless pull of the moon, millions of gallons of water are violently sucked back out into the Gulf of Tonkin. For the Mongol armada, hovering directly over the kill zone, the first sign of doom is not a volley of arrows, but a sickening, unnatural drag. The starving oarsmen in the lower decks feel their blades suddenly scraping against thick mud instead of cutting through open water. The massive, heavy-bottomed war junks begin to slow down, losing their lethal momentum. General Omar, commanding from the rear, barks furious orders to keep rowing, assuming the vanguard has simply grazed a shifting sandbar. He does not realize the river is literally falling out from underneath his feet. Then, the tense silence of the standoff is shattered by a sound that will echo in the nightmares of the Yuan dynasty forever. It is the deafening, explosive shriek of shattering timber. Near the front of the vanguard, a colossal warship suddenly lurches violently upward. A massive, iron-tipped ironwood stake, anchored deep in the bedrock, punches straight through the reinforced wooden underbelly of the hull like a spear through paper. The kinetic energy of a multi-ton ship riding the current into a stationary pillar is catastrophic. The lower decks cave in instantly. Screaming oarsmen are impaled where they sit. The murky river water violently hemorrhages into the gaping breach, dragging the ship down further onto the spike. But this is not an isolated shipwreck. As the water level plummets, dropping several yards in a horrifyingly short window of time, the entire underwater forest is exposed. Hundreds of tightly packed Mongol warships lose their buoyancy at the exact same moment. They come crashing down onto the unforgiving, sharpened teeth of Tran Hung Dao's mechanical trap. The estuary instantly transforms into a wooden slaughterhouse. Hulls are violently gutted open from bow to stern. The sheer weight of the ships, loaded with heavily armored men and desperate supplies, causes them to impale themselves deeper onto the unyielding stakes. Massive wooden masts snap under the sudden deceleration and crash onto the crowded decks, crushing skulls and snapping spines. Ships violently tilt and capsize, throwing thousands of terrified Mongol warriors into the churning, muddy water. But there is no bottom to stand on. If they sink, they are drowned by the suffocating weight of their own armor. If they thrash to the surface, they are pushed by the violent, swirling current into the jagged, submerged spikes, skewered alive in the freezing water. This was not a battle. It was a geographical execution. In a matter of minutes, the myth of Kublai Khan's naval supremacy was violently dismantled. The invincible Mongol fleet destroyed itself, not by the swords of a superior army, but by the ruthless mathematical application of gravity and wood. The greatest armada the Eastern world had ever seen was now nothing more than a colossal, splintered dam of shattered timber and dying men completely immobilized in the sucking mud. General Omar watches his floating city of death tear itself to pieces. His ships are bleeding out into the river, trapped and absolutely helpless. His men are drowning in the mud, screaming for a rescue that cannot come. The trap has snapped shut perfectly. The beast is pinned by its own weight, its belly ripped open by the planet itself. And as the terrified survivors cling to the shattered remains of their fleet, coughing up river water and looking desperately toward the banks, they realize the true horror is just beginning. The tiny Vietnamese bait boats have cleared the area, and stepping out from the shadows of the jungle is the main army of Dai Viet. Thousands of archers stand shoulder to shoulder, their bowstrings pulled taut, holding flaming arrows that reflect in the terrified eyes of a trapped, bleeding predator. The water has done its job. Now it is time for the fire. There is a specific, terrifying sound that a wooden ship makes when it catches fire. It is not a gentle crackle, it is a violent, roaring hiss as the heat violently boils the sap trapped inside the timber. Now multiply that sound by 400. As the massive Mongol armada sat hopelessly impaled on Tran Hung Dao's submerged forest, the jungle tree line erupted. Thousands of Vietnamese archers stepped from the shadows and unleashed a localized apocalypse. The sky literally went dark, replaced by a screaming canopy of flaming arrows arcing directly into the tightly packed, immobilized fleet. For the Mongol forces, the situation instantly transitioned from a navigational disaster to a biological oven. The heavy war junks of the Yuan dynasty were heavily waterproofed with thick layers of pitch and tar, making them incredibly resilient to the corrosive seawater. But right now, that waterproofing turned every single vessel into a colossal floating matchstick. The fire spread with a hungry, unnatural speed, jumping from shattered deck to shattered deck, consuming the towering canvas sails and instantly cooking the men trapped in the lower rowing galleys. The invincible warriors of the steppes were suddenly presented with a horrifying, impossible choice. They could stay on the decks and be roasted alive in their armor, or they could jump into the churning, muddy waters of the Bach Dang River. Thousands chose the water. It was the last mistake they ever made. When a heavily armored man jumps into a tidal mudflat, he does not swim. He sinks. The Mongol infantry wore thick leather and iron lamellar armor designed to deflect the glancing blows of a cavalry saber. In the suffocating, sucking mud of the estuary, that armor functioned as a bespoke anchor. The water was shallow, but the mud underneath was deep, silty, and entirely unforgiving. Panicking soldiers plunged into the freezing water, only to find their boots instantly swallowed by the riverbed. As they thrashed wildly to keep their heads above the surface, the weight of their wet armor and weapons dragged them face first into the murky sludge. And waiting for them in that mud was the main force of the Dai Viet army. The Vietnamese soldiers were not burdened by heavy iron plates. They were lightly equipped, highly mobile, and intimately familiar with the treacherous physics of their own river. They glided across the shallows in lightning-fast skiffs, or waded through the muck with terrifying ease, armed with long spears, hooked halberds, and heavy clubs. They did not engage the Mongols in glorious, honorable duels. This was not a battlefield. It was an extermination site. The Vietnamese systematically moved through the wreckage, butchering the invaders as they blindly struggled in the water. Halberds hooked onto the edges of Mongol armor, dragging gasping men beneath the surface until the bubbles stopped. Spears were thrust downward into the helpless, thrashing crowds. The river itself thickened into a horrific, viscous sludge of silt, ash, and human blood. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the metallic, copper scent of mass death, creating an atmosphere so suffocating it broke the minds of the survivors. The Mongols, a people who had built an empire by mastering the psychology of terror, were finally tasting their own medicine. They begged for mercy, screaming in a dozen different languages across the burning wreckage. But the Dai Viet army offered no quarter. You do not show mercy to a parasite that has come to burn your home and enslave your children. The slaughter was industrial, relentless, and absolutely devoid of pity. By midday, the mighty armada that was supposed to secure the total domination of Southeast Asia had been reduced to a sprawling, smoking graveyard. General Omar's floating city was entirely gone. In its place was a horrific dam of charred wood and mutilated corpses choking the mouth of the Bach Dang River. The greatest military machine the world had ever known had been drowned, burned, and beaten to death in the mud by a people who simply refused to be conquered. When the smoke finally cleared over the Bach Dang estuary, the water was no longer its natural muddy brown. It was a thick, stagnant crimson, choked with the bloated bodies of men and horses. 400 heavy warships of the great Yuan dynasty, the undisputed apex predators of the 13th century, had been reduced to a splintered, smouldering dam of wreckage. General Omar, the ruthless commander, who was supposed to drown the kingdom in blood, was dragged from the freezing mud entirely alive. He was coughing up river water, stripped of his dignity, and shivering in the absolute mercy of the people he had confidently called savages. His capture was the ultimate, bitter humiliation. The invincible Mongol war machine did not just lose a naval skirmish, it was mathematically, biologically, and geographically dismantled. Back in his luxurious imperial capital, thousands of miles away, Kublai Khan received the news of the slaughter like a physical blow to the chest. The great Khan had spent his entire life watching the known world bow to his banners. He had conquered the supposedly impenetrable fortresses of China and terrorized the vast open steppes. But this tiny, sweltering, disease-ridden jungle kingdom had completely broken his momentum. The total destruction of his supply fleet at Bach Dang was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological amputation for the empire. The Mongols would attempt minor raids in the following years out of sheer, stubborn pride, but the grand, apocalyptic dream of swallowing Southeast Asia died permanently in the mud of that river. Dai Viet had drawn a violent line in the swamp and forced the greatest empire on planet Earth to choke on it. History as a discipline loves to obsess over the sheer size of an army. We romanticize the thundering charge of heavy cavalry, the silhouettes of massive armadas, and the terrifying aura of global conquerors. But the Battle of Bach Dang teaches us a brutally different, highly uncomfortable lesson about the true nature of warfare. It proves that massive numbers are completely irrelevant if you cannot feed the mouths of your soldiers. It proves that state-of-the-art heavy armor is nothing more than an expensive, fatal anchor if you are forced to fight in a tidal swamp. Most importantly, it shows us exactly what happens when a defending force successfully weaponizes its own geography. Tran Hung Dao did not defeat the Mongols by matching their strength or fighting harder. He defeated them by fighting fundamentally smarter. He turned the gravitational pull of the moon and the dense, unforgiving wood of the jungle into the ultimate weapons of mass destruction. The Vietnamese people survived the Mongol apocalypse because they collectively understood a fundamental truth of survival. When you are fighting a heavily armored, starving monster, you do not stand directly in front of it with a sword. You starve it further, you bleed it with 1,000 tiny cuts, and you wait patiently for it to step blindly into the mechanical jaws of the earth. Today, the iron-tipped wooden stakes of Bach Dang are preserved as museum relics, petrified reminders of the day a localized, meticulously engineered meat grinder broke the spine of a global superpower. It stands as a timeless testament to the terrifying ingenuity of human survival. It reminds empires that when the environment itself is rigged to kill you, even the gods of war will eventually drown in the mud. If you found this deep dive into the brutal mechanics of medieval naval warfare fascinating, please help us win our own battle against the algorithm by hitting that like button and subscribing. It really does make a difference in keeping these forgotten, gritty stories alive. And I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the Mongols could have ever successfully conquered Southeast Asia if they had fundamentally changed their tactics, or was the harsh, tropical geography always going to be an impossible, lethal trap for a steppe empire? Let the debate begin down below. If you want to see how another seemingly invincible military machine was violently brought to its knees by a hostile environment and desperate defenders, click the video on your screen right now. Until next time, remember that history is not just a painted map of glorious empires. It is a graveyard of their fatal mistakes.